The New Deal was the label applied to Franklin D. Roosevelt's domestic program. The New Deal vastly expanded the power and reach of the federal government over the economy and into social welfare matters. But as many programs as were created in the 30s under the New Deal, dozens of them, almost all of them could be fit into one of three categories, the so-called 3 Rs: relief, recovery, and reform. Most of the New Deal was accomplished in two phases, the so-called First New Deal, 1933-34, and then the Second New Deal of 1935. Among the major relief programs of the First New Deal were the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, the Civil Works Administration, and the Civilian Conservation Corps. The idea here was to put unemployed people to work on the government payroll. Of these three, by far the most popular and applauded was the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. Even people who disliked most of the New Deal thought that the CCC was not a bad idea, partly because of who it helped, unemployed young men between the ages of 18 and 25, and also because of the work that it did. It was organized along military lines, even though you were not in the military if you joined the CCC. But the young men who joined did conservation work, which was desperately needed. They were housed, clothed, and fed by the government, but they were paid $1 a day. And since their basic needs were being met, they were expected to send $25 to help out their families. So the CCC was, again, in many respects, the most universally applauded of all New Deal agencies. As far as the major recovery programs of the first New Deal, there was one for agriculture and one for industry. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration was created in 1933 to help American agriculture get back on its feet. The basic idea behind AAA was to pay farmers a benefit payment in order to encourage them to take land out of production, because the main reason agricultural prices were depressed is because the market was glutted. It was obviously a controversial approach, particularly at a time when many people were going hungry, but in the long run, AAA's approach did help agriculture to recover. NRA, the National Recovery Administration, was designed to do the same thing for industry that AAA did for agriculture, but for a variety of reasons, it never really worked very well, and in 1935, it was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. In many ways, the most important New Deal programs were the reform programs. These were meant to be permanent, and many of them are still around. Just to highlight a few from the first New Deal, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, was created to regulate the stock and bond markets. Many of the things that were done on Wall Street in the 20s that contributed to the Great Crash and the onset of the Depression were not technically illegal because there was virtually no regulation of the stock market. Now there is a new federal regulatory agency, the SEC, designed to lay down some rules for Wall Street and to enforce them. A very important program created during the first New Deal was the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Many people had lost all of their life savings when their banks failed in 1932 and 33. And if your bank went under, you lost everything because there was no deposit insurance. So the FDIC was created and established so that the federal government would ensure the safety of bank deposits. One of the boldest New Deal programs was the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. Its leaders had a grand vision for TVA, which was never fully realized, but what TVA did do was to provide hydroelectric power for thousands of customers in the Tennessee River Valley, which was a very impoverished part of the country. The 1934 off-year elections shaped up as the first referendum on the New Deal. Historically, the party that's in power loses seats in Congress in the off-year elections, but in 1934, the Democrats, Roosevelt's party, increased their already large majorities in both houses of Congress. So to the extent that the 1934 elections can be seen as a referendum on the New Deal, an overwhelming majority of voters seemed to approve. However, by 1935, the New Deal was also being criticized from both ends of the political spectrum. On one end were conservatives who thought that the New Deal was too much big government and was costing too much money. The Supreme Court, which consisted of 9 old men, that's what Roosevelt called them, and they were all male and they were all old, had already struck down several pieces of New Deal legislation, including NRA. So the New Deal, to some extent, seemed to be stymied from the right. On the other end of the spectrum, there were critics who were charging that the New Deal had not done nearly enough to alleviate suffering. One of these was Dr. Francis Townsend, a retired physician from California, who advocated a colossally expensive program in which the federal government would guarantee every senior citizen an annual income. And poverty among senior citizens was extreme. The most dangerous critic of the New Deal for not doing enough was the so-called kingfish of Louisiana, Huey Long, governor and later senator from Louisiana, who believed that the number one economic problem facing the country was that too much wealth was concentrated in too few hands. Long was probably right about that in many respects, but his solution was to confiscate all fortunes in excess of $1 million through heavy taxation and use the money to guarantee every American family an annual income. If there was one person in America who was more effective at communicating via the radio than President Roosevelt, it was Huey Long, and Long started to build quite a following through his so-called Share Our Wealth program. Roosevelt himself referred to Huey Long as one of the 2 most dangerous men in America, the other being General Douglas MacArthur. At any rate, in 1935, Roosevelt's response to his critics was to encourage Congress to pass a new wave of legislation. This came to be referred to as the Second New Deal. Most of the programs of the Second New Deal were meant to be permanent, and again, many of them are still with us. One was the Wagner Act, or officially the National Labor Relations Act of 1935. The Wagner Act guaranteed the right of workers to organize and join unions and bargain collectively with management. While this did not, it also created a new federal regulatory agency, the National Labor Relations Board. While this did not mean that the government would now always take the side of labor in any dispute, it did mean that for the first time in American history, the federal government was not hostile to organized labor. Also, we have the Revenue Act of 1935, sometimes called the Wealth Tax Act, or by critics, the Soak the Rich tax. This was a direct response to Huey Long, and though the Revenue Act of 1935 did raise taxes on upper income brackets considerably, it was nothing close to what Huey Long was advocating. Most importantly was the Social Security Act of 1935. In fact, Roosevelt himself said that Social Security was the cornerstone and supreme achievement of the New Deal, and it was a response to Dr. Townsend and his constituency. Social Security did do much and has continued for over 80 years to do much to alleviate poverty among senior citizens, but again, it was not anywhere close to what Townsend was advocating. Finally, there was the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, which in a sense was another work relief program, but it was one organized on a massive scale. And between the establishment of WPA in 1935 and its going out of existence in 1943, the WPA spent billions of dollars and employed hundreds of thousands of workers who otherwise would not have had a job. So it is basically a work relief program, but the WPA concentrated heavily on big construction projects, dams, reservoirs, schools, airports, roads, bridges, things of that nature. And the WPA in many ways left its own monuments in the form of big construction projects, many of which are still in use. The 1936 election, in which Roosevelt runs for a second term, was a major referendum on the New Deal. Roosevelt won in a landslide, a huge landslide, over his Republican opponent, Governor Alfred Landon of Kansas. In the Electoral College, Roosevelt beat Landon 523-8, and so there doesn't seem to be much way to interpret the results of the 1936 election other than to say that an overwhelming majority of American voters endorsed Roosevelt and the New Deal for a second term. However, Roosevelt got a little carried away, and in 1937 and 38, he made a series of miscalculations which pretty much brought an end to the New Deal as far as new legislation. His biggest mistake was the so-called court packing plan, in which he tried to get the Congress to increase the size of the Supreme Court in order to wipe out the conservative majority. This blew up in Roosevelt's face. He got nothing that he wanted, and even though he later claimed that he lost the battle but won the war because he eventually got to appoint almost an entirely new court, in many ways he lost the battle and the war because a conservative coalition formed in Congress consisting of Republicans and conservative Southern Democrats who refused to approve any more New Deal legislation. 1937 also saw the Roosevelt recession, as some called it. After slow but steady economic progress during Roosevelt's first term, the economy slumped again in 1937. Then in 1938, Roosevelt attempted to drive all the conservatives out of the Democratic Party and turn it into an all-liberal party. He did this by intervening personally in several Democratic primaries where a conservative incumbent was being challenged by a more liberal challenger. Roosevelt was very popular with the American people at this point, but that did not mean that voters necessarily wanted to be told whom they were to vote for, and so the purge failed miserably. As of 1938, then, the New Deal was essentially over as far as any new legislation, and had it not been for the international crisis, which is about to erupt into World War II, I think Roosevelt would have been a two-term president. However, with the world now in flames, in 1940, Roosevelt decided that he would break with tradition, as he frequently did, and run for a third term in office.